Hey everybody, welcome to the Power Mapping to Create Institutional Change webinar. This is part of a series of webinars about how to move forward a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens within your organization. Our last webinar was on the future of equity and featured Dwayne Proctor from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation as our co-presenter. You can access those webinars at tristaharris.org. So I'm Trista Harris. I'm a philanthropic futurist, and I've been working with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to help them create a more equitable future. And today we have with us Dwayne Proctor, who's Senior Advisor to the President at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Dwayne, can you tell us a little bit about why the foundation is supporting this series of webinars?
We're very happy to do so, and we feel that doing so kind of lives up to an African proverb of if you want to go far, you go with others. If you want to go fast, you go alone. And I think for all of us working in this field, we all know that the changes that we're trying to make to the institutions that we represent, there's no way to really go fast to do so. Organizational change takes time, but it also takes leadership. And so RWJF's support of this webinar and other activities, similar activities, is to help provide leadership to this field so that as we are doing the very hard work of organizational change, we also begin to know who our colleagues are around the country, take that opportunity to network and fellowship and share as we learn and as we go, so that all of us can grow and all of us can make progress on this issue that we feel is very, very important.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Dwayne. And my co-presenter today is Karyn Sciortino Johnson. Karyn, can you introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about what you do in your work?
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. Karyn Sciortino Johnson. I'm the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Manager at McKnight Foundation. I have been in this position about 2 years, and I'm really primarily responsible for helping us operationalize some of our commitments within the foundation. So I oversee our diversity, equity, and inclusion action teams, so work groups that are formed to make recommendations for change in our policies and procedures and practices. I sit on the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Advisory Committee for the Foundation, and I am working to help the Foundation staff really with their learning agenda, which is around racial equity in 2018 and 19.
Fantastic. Thanks, Karyn. So the McKnight Foundation is going to be our example today to help bring some of the concepts to life as we talk about power mapping within your organizations. So today we're going to talk about why power mapping is a helpful tool. We're going to talk about identifying decision makers and understanding power and influence, how to utilize outside allies, what key drivers for success look like, how to troubleshoot, and then some tips for implementation. So we're going to have lots of opportunities to think about how this tool applies to your organization, so have a pen and paper handy. So first of all, power mapping is a tool that is traditionally used in organizations in organizing campaigns to help understand what it takes to get somebody on your side. It's a tool not only to identify who holds power, but even more crucially, who holds influence over those people that hold power. So it helps you figure out who to target with your direct actions and your campaign activities. It's also a really powerful tool when you're trying to move innovation forward within your own organization. So the first step in this process is understanding who your key decision makers are. So for example, if you were trying to move forward an effort to create job descriptions that were more likely to recruit diverse candidates, you'd have to get the people that have positional power on board first. So that might be a hiring manager or your director of HR. But then you also need to get people on board that are in power centers. So those are people that might not have authority, but this is usually the person that has the ability to implement a policy for it to be successful. So in this case, it might be the communications assistant who writes the job descriptions, might be a key power center that you have to get on board for it to work. So within your own organization, I'd encourage you to write down this little visual and think about who in your organization has a lot of power and who has a little bit of power. And think about who is a current supporter of this and who is a current opponent. And this could be about DEI within your organization overall, or it might be about specific policies that you're trying to move forward. So if you're facilitating this sort of thing within your own organization, you could bring together a team like Karyn just described at the McKnight Foundation, who's helping you implement this change, and together you could brainstorm and you could think about who lives in each of these quadrants. It's something that, you know, you can use a million different Post-it notes, and as you're sort of envisioning who lives these places of lots of power, a little bit of power, current supporter and current opponent, after you do that brainstorming and you all kind of stick it up on the board, then you have a discussion and figure out where there's some disagreement. So maybe somebody thought that the HR director had a lot of power and somebody else thought they had a little bit of power. Thinking about why that is super helpful, because it means that you can negotiate a little bit in that process and figure out who belongs where. The other thing is that sometimes people in positional power have lots of ability to move things forward. So that could be your CEO or your director of a specific department. And sometimes people without positional power have a lot of power when it comes to implementing a policy. So if you have a person that's in charge of picking people for events, so like an event coordinator is picking lots of vendors, they have a ton of power when it comes to implementing something like a diverse vendor policy. Supporter and current opponent doesn't mean that somebody, if somebody was a current opponent, it doesn't mean that maybe they're not interested in equity. Somebody might be a current opponent if they don't feel like you're pushing hard enough. So let's go back to that diverse vendor example. Let's say that you wanted to have 20% of your vendors are people of color. If you had somebody in your organization that said, I refuse to support the policy unless it's 100%, then that's somebody that would be listed as a current opponent, even though there's somebody that is excited about the progress or the work of the organization. They may not feel like it's enough, and then they live in that current opponent place. So next, I'm going to have Karyn talk just a little bit about what the process has looked like at the McKnight Foundation as they've gone through their DEI journey and how the foundation thinks about power.
Okay, so we were really intentional about both decision makers and power centers as we were moving out of our intercultural competence development work and started a conversation around DEI. So as I mentioned before, we have a Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Advisory Committee, and we really wanted to make sure that we had decision makers at that table, as well as other folks that were situated in other places in the foundation. So it was really important that people had authorizing authorities, is the way that we talk about it, to make institutional-wide cultural change. And then it was also important, as we were forming this committee, that it wasn't just one person's responsibility for culture. So we wanted to spread it out. So we included our president and then the two VPs responsible for internal operations and external engagement. And then we had 3 additional staff. So it was a relatively small advisory committee. The 3 additional staff were our finance assistant, our arts program officer, and me. And at the time, I was a program administrator for the international program team. Again, we just want to make sure that the committee both had authorizing authority within the committee and also voices that were not already on the senior leadership team. Each one of the people on staff, the additional 3 staff that were on the team or on the committee, had their own power centers in terms of their influence with other folks in the foundation. So each one of us used our positional power and influence with others to champion DEI efforts throughout the foundation. Our committee included 3 white women and 3 women of color. And then later, when our director of learning was hired, he also joined the committee, and he's also a man of color. So we created work groups, another effort in order to actually get after paying attention to power centers. We created work groups of staff. So people that were interested in examining a specific policy or practice and making recommendations for how we could implement it in order to be more equitable, more inclusive on our diversity. So staff volunteered for these work groups. And then we made sure to include the authorizing authority on each of the teams. So for example, our VP of Operations was added to the Vendor Diversity Policy Work Group. We had learned from our initial work that authorizing authority needed both to be at the table to help right-size what was possible, so the container of what was possible in terms of change, and then also to give permission for making real change. So for example, our holiday policy, actually getting permission from the person that could give it to be audacious in our recommendations was really powerful and was very helpful to help people understand that it didn't necessarily have to be changes on the edges. It could be, we could completely redo a policy. Yeah.
That's fantastic. And Karyn, one of the things that I forgot to ask you to give a little bit of context, can you say just a little bit about what the McKnight Foundation does and the sort of size and scope of the work?
Oh, sure. So the McKnight Foundation is a private family foundation. We have 8 current program areas right now. We have been around for about 60 years. The family is still very much present and important parts of the board. And so the family is now in the 4th generation. We have about 50 staff members, and our programs are very much driven from the 4th generation's passions and interests. So we have an arts program, education program, international program that focuses on collaborative crop research, a Midwest climate and energy program, Mississippi River neuroscience, and region and communities. And then we also have specific grantee relationships with other foundations in Minnesota located in greater Minnesota.
Perfect. I think that's great context, because often I hear from people that say this work is great, but we can't do it because we're a family foundation, or we can't do it because the staff is too large, or the scope of our organization is too broad or too narrow. And I think McKnight's a great example, because it wasn't easy to move it through, but with purposeful direction, I think it made really significant change in the organization. So thanks for giving that backdrop.
Absolutely.
So next we're going to talk just a little bit about power and influence. So we've covered this just a little bit, but power and influence are different. So some people may be in positions of power and they can move forward a DEI agenda. Others may not have power, but they have influence where they can positively or negatively move forward this sort of effort or stop this sort of effort. And I think as you're considering where those kind of levers and people that are able to move things forward, exist within an institution, there is often somebody within your institution that doesn't have a title that looks like they're the sort of person that can move something through. But if they are the person that's determining what's going to be on the board agenda, or if they're a person that is in the space of implementing policy or deciding how to interpret policy, those are places where there's lots of opportunity for great support or great challenges. So as you fill out your own map of where people live when it comes to power and influence and support and not currently supporting your work, it's important to understand who your key allies are. So who are people with a significant amount of power that are supporting your efforts? Who are your key opponents? So those are people that have a lot of power when it comes to the issues that you're trying to move forward, and understand who they are so that you can start to narrow what that push looks like and how you can focus on those individuals. So for Karyn, a question for you is, who are the key supporters at McKnight, and then how did you leverage that support?
Sure. Well, I'll start. So I report to the VP of Operations, or did do. And so they were very much, core, had the power and the influence both at an institutional level. And so we were thought partners for sure. The formation of the DEI Advisory Committee was actually trying to leverage both the power and influence across, so that we would have a team of champions. That wouldn't just be the responsibility of the VP of Operations. I was brought on board once the DEI Advisory Committee was formed. A little bit later, my role changed to be the DEI manager. So we really were trying to spread out that, and then engaging the different DEI work groups was also another way of activating key supporters. So the people that were on the work groups volunteered. They were very interested in the various work groups that they signed up for. So for example, the vendor diversity policy folks were interested in making change, and they were both folks that were responsible for decision making at the foundation, and also the implementers. So the program administrators, the grant administrators, folks in IT, they all sat on that work group so that they could be provide input in the recommendations moving forward. I'll also say we have, we're a larger family foundation. We have both family members and community members on the board. The president's role in practice was to really bring the board along, to be the key supporter, and to really, as we were attempting to shift our culture, to be more equitable and inclusive. So we have a practice of forming board staff work groups, again, to really get at that leverage and support. So that there are board members on work groups when we're at important inflection points around programs or operations. And so it's a really important way for us to leverage our board expertise and staff expertise, while also, having opportunities to inform and engage other board members that are not directly involved in the work groups. So we had a board staff work group that created our DEI statement and helped us articulate DEI is critical to our mission. As a result, when it was time to revisit our strategic framework, which includes our mission, vision, values, and priorities, the board chose to change our mission to really put DEI as more central and core. So that was all due to a lot of key supporters leveraging their positions and influence to help us move forward.
Super smart. The next part I'll talk about is outside allies. So outside allies can have a really great influence on inside change. If you can think of who are the organizations that your key decision makers trust, had those organizations done work on diversity, equity, and inclusion? Could they be a key resource when you're sharing reports or strategy or data? Sometimes change is faster when there is that outside pressure, especially for foundation folks that are on the call. It's often hard to create change within foundations because there isn't significant outside pressure. So sometimes outside allies, that peer pressure of, oh my gosh, I see the McKnight Foundation is doing really great work. What are we doing on this? Actually moves forward internal change a lot faster than it normally would. Sometimes you can partner together just to spread the work. So could you create a shared database of diverse vendors? Could you share job descriptions and information about openings? Those are the places where you can really start to get that traction. There are a couple of key questions to ask as you're thinking about outside allies. Who are the other foundations, nonprofits, or local government agencies that are also concerned about DEI or the specific policy that you're trying to move forward, like diversifying your investment managers or diverse vendors? And then how could you work together to expand your impact? So I think there has been a lot of examples of organizations, nonprofits, foundations, local government agencies that have started to partner together on these efforts, and there's an accountability that comes along with that, and there is an information sharing that is really, really important. So for Karyn, for you, which outside organizations were critical when you were thinking about DEI at McKnight?
Well, so we partnered initially with the Minnesota Council on Foundations and several foundation partners that were also moving in a DEI direction. I think lots of folks are talking about it. There's a lot of interest, and I think we're all kind of in fairly early stages of actually operationalizing. We do have, one community partner, Headwaters, that really I have, growing my relationships with them and with other foundations around the country that are doing their own internal work, as kind of helping me catch a vision for what's possible. And then also really setting my own, being clear about some of the struggles. It's really helpful actually to know that this is hard work for everybody. And so setting expectations of what's possible and what the pace looks like, and then also driving together and sharing ideas has been super helpful as well. So when I think about, and we were like one of the largest foundations in Minnesota. I anticipate that as we continue to make this change, we're going to hear some more critique. Up until now, most of what we've been doing has been internal. And so, right now we're in that first few steps of launching a new program that advances a more equitable and inclusive Minnesota, focusing on economic mobility, equitable development, and civic engagement, specifically to advance racial equity. And so we're just now, in fact, this week, starting a series of listening sessions to hear from communities around Minnesota about their priorities for that program. I'm anticipating we're going to hear critique and priorities and in those listening sessions, but we haven't gathered that data yet. I've also heard a wait and see approach. I mean, this is kind of a sea change for us. We've talked about disparities as economic up until now. And so to actually name race and systemic and institutionalized racism explicitly, I think a lot of our community partners are watching and waiting to see how it all shakes out.
That's perfect. And Karyn, can you tell us just a little bit more about that relationship with Headwaters, what sort of organization they are, and how that came about and what it looks like now?
Well, I think they're They are actually, I mean, they're a colleague. I think they have been a grantee. It's a way for us to invest in other organizations in the community that aren't necessarily connected directly to our 8 program specific silos, right? We've invited them to be a partner in our, in the listening sessions. And I'm just building relationships directly with the folks there, because I think that there's just a lot of opportunities for us to think and challenge one another from where we sit.
Perfect. And I think one of the other important parts about that for the foundation folks that are on the call, Headwaters is the social justice foundation that's been doing this racial equity work for 35 plus years. And in your own communities, there are partners that have really started with this frame and can be a great resource for the nonprofit leaders that are on the phone. Same for you. There are organizations that really lead in this area, and when you pull them into your network, it really strengthens your ability to do great work and learn from their expertise as you move forward.
Exactly.
So next is thinking about key drivers for success. So what are the things that you need for your plan to be successful? If you're doing this with your team, have people brainstorm what this looks like. So when I've done this with other organizations, it may be things like, CEO wanting to be recognized as a leader on DEI. If that's a key driver for success, then what are some of the strategies in place that make it more likely that recognition will happen? It's important to think about who those key supporters are that you need to engage, and then who are the current opponents that you need to pull in. What you'll see here is a power map that gives sort of a visual of how to think about influence within your organization. So these darker lines that you see and the direction are who has more influence on somebody else in the organization. The lighter ones are somebody that has influence but not as much. And this can look different for every single issue that you're working on. So if you were doing a diverse vendor policy, the players that would be on this sort of map would be different than if you were thinking about HR within your organization. So if you were trying to change the mind of Wallace from the HR department that you see on this, you have to get either the CFO or Francis, who is described as the change agent. I love that. We all know those people within our organizations that are the ones that really push and move things through. You have to get them on your side, preferably both of them on your side, to be able to influence Wallace. So I'd encourage you to spend just a minute thinking about one of the current opponents that you have when it comes to moving your efforts forward, people that have lots of power that you listed earlier, and think about who has influence over them. For folks that are doing community organizing power maps, you'll often see versions of this that'll include things like church leaders or their neighbor or their wife or somebody that's on a board of directors with them. There's lots of different ways that people are influenced, but as you're thinking within your organization, it's often easier just to start with who within the institution has some influence on them. The other ways that I've seen organizations use this sort of map is to think about those outside allies that have influence. So maybe Wallace is on a national, HR best practices task force. Well, if you've got some influence there and you can provide some pressure, they may be able to provide pressure on the person that you're trying to focus on within your organization. One of the tricks that I often use when I'm trying to move organizational change efforts forward is, let's say I know that the CEO of an organization that I'm working with is very influenced by grantmakers for effective organizations. Well, if we're trying to move forward DEI work, I'm going to send them articles from grantmakers for effective organizations so that they feel like it's coming from a source that I trust, and yet it's pushing on the same thing that I'm hearing about internally. And then the other important thing is to think about possible barriers. So I encourage organizations to think about doing a pre-mortem. Sometimes we talk about post-mortems after you do a project, thinking about, what didn't go well, but you can use that same effort and do it before a project even starts. So if I was trying to move forward a diverse vendor policy within an organization, and I went through a pre-mortem and thought about what are the many different ways that this might not be successful and which ones are most likely. So if the challenge may be technology, maybe we're not able to keep track in our current database of which vendors are diverse vendors and which ones aren't, and so we can't keep track of our progress. And if I know that that's something that might kill the project, then I'm going to reach out to the person that's managing our Salesforce database or whoever's managing our accounting system to figure out with them, how much would a solution cost? What would it look like? How would we have to structure it for this to work? I think for many of us, we spend a lot of time planning for our projects to be successful, which is fantastic, but spending just a little bit of time figuring out how it might not be successful really can make a huge difference. So Karyn, what are some of the barriers that you identified at McKnight as you were starting this work?
I think one of the barriers was much like what you talked about in the opening slides. There is a challenge, we're doing organizational change, right? So culture change, that balance between too much change and not enough or not fast enough is really quite real for us. So balancing expectations. For some of us, equity looks like these 5 things. And so for other of us, equity looks like these 25 things. And if you don't do all 25, you're not doing it, right? So that's a tension for us. And so it's been interesting to help people engage, no matter what their definition is. So to move forward. I've compared DEI work as it's kind of like stand-up comedy, like nobody starts out being great at it. You kind of have to get up there and test out your material, and sometimes you get booed off stage, and then you have to adjust and get back up there. It's really experimental, and so holding that tension of being able to continue to be experimental and to actually adjust when things are not working has been basically much of our internal work the last 2 years. Another barrier really has been around the amount of change that's possible in an organization. So if anybody has been paying attention at all to some of the press releases we've been putting out lately, we've had a lot of leadership transition this past year. We've also been in the midst of a program design process. And then on top of it, DEI. So one of the things that's been great is that we've been able to actually put front and center DEI in the program redesign process instead of trying to make little changes on the edges of existing programs. We've been able to move forward with an entire program. However, there's only so much stuff that people can do. So we've really needed to adjust our strategies and work groups in order to give people time to attend to the various priorities. And so the challenge really has been about how to adjust without losing momentum.
And Karyn, I think you said a really important thing, which is this sort of perfect being the enemy of the good. And that can stop these efforts just in their tracks for 2 reasons. One is sort of who's the wokest person on staff that is not going to be happy unless you are fixing everything all at once and immediately. And then the other is staff that are super uncomfortable with change and they use perfection as a way to not have to move at all. So unless you figure it out for every system within our organization, I'm not going to start it for my part of the organization. And both of those can be really toxic as we're doing these sort of efforts. So I know for myself that I have to push back on that idea of perfection because, you know, I want to see it all fixed and I want to see it all better. But if you live too much in that space, it really stops your efforts in their tracks.
Yes, absolutely.
So soon we're going to have time for questions and answers. So if you go into the chat box and you post your questions, I'll be able to see those, and then Karyn and Dwayne and I can answer those questions. So next we're going to talk about implementation strategy. So I'll give you an example of what this might look like for an organization that is doing a diverse vendor policy. And you hear me use that example quite a bit. The reason that I use it is because for organizations that are trying to move forward diversity, equity, and inclusion, vendor policies are often a really easy place to start. It's a little bit external, so it allows people to not be as nervous as they might be if it is, you know, 100% internal work right away. It changes who's interacting with your organization in a really powerful way that often leads to greater change and greater change. And it's very tangible, and it's something that's countable, which isn't always the case when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so that's why many organizations make that a part of their early work. So for an organization that's doing a diverse vendor policy, first there's a strategy that's about just getting the policy approved. And so that's about what does it take for this to actually just be a thing. So for this example organization, some of the strategy pieces might be help the CEO feel like a champion for this and make sure there's no surprises. So how do you position the CEO or the executive director of your organization to really be ready to lead on these efforts? Next is to have a clear process for decision making. So if you're changing vendors, it gives people a lot of comfort if you can start to say, here's our new criteria. Longtime vendor, how do you fit within that criteria? Having best practices is often helpful. So for some people within organizations, they don't feel comfortable moving change forward until they have heard how other organizations have done this work. The challenge on DEI best practices is that often there just isn't a lot written in the sort of best practice framework. And so I sometimes talk about next practices. So it may not have the research base that a best practice does, but it really is the place that the field is moving. And then last, to get that strategy forward on getting that policy approved, it might be researching how much this would cost. So if you've got to do changes to your accounting system or buy access to a database of diverse vendors, which exists in most states, there are costs that are tied to that. And so that can be a place where efforts really get held up if people didn't understand that there were budget implications and they didn't research those costs on the front end. The second part of implementation is, the second part of strategy is actually getting it implemented. So some of the ways that you can think about that in this specific example is developing a report by staff member. So in my former organization, the Minnesota Council on Foundations, we had a printout for each staff member review time that showed me how much that particular staff member was spending with diverse vendors, and we had a 20% goal. So I could tell if my staff person was on track or off track for that goal, and we could talk about it in the framework of performance overall. So having that data really helps with implementation as opposed to it just being sort of this organizational number. It's really about how individual people are making changes. Another piece on implementation might be just a spreadsheet of diverse vendors and keeping that on the intranet. So people keeping track of who they're able to reach out to and building that list as you go. The next piece is making sure that staff are comfortable in implementation and they know where to reach out if they're having a hard time. So in my former organization, there were challenges as we were thinking about diverse vendors for printing, which was something that we did a lot of. And our lead in the communications department was having a really hard time figuring out who to reach out to. And so they reached out to me, and I reached out to some other folks in the organization, and we were able to identify some vendors that we could try out. And then next is to ask all managers, not just senior staff, that to make sure that they have capacity to support the implementation of this policy and are able to identify vendors. So that's where things like buying a database come in really helpful. So if a supervisor or even a senior leader in the organization is saying, well, gosh, I don't even know how to do this. How am I going to support my staff? It really makes a big difference if those resources are in place. So this is another place where that pre-mortem work is super helpful. If you know that these are places where folks might run into trouble, you can build some resources in place so that that doesn't actually become a problem. So next we've got a few minutes for question and answer. So use that little chat box that you should probably see at the top or the side of your screen, depending on where you've moved it around, and enter in your questions in the chat. The first one that I have is a comment from Corey Anderson. So he is at a smaller organization, and he said, it's important to understand that the power map is not dependent on being a part of a large organization. Even if you have a 10 or 12 person staff, it's still really important, especially if you're trying to be inclusive of board and staff members and consultants. And so I think that's a good reminder that some of these tools are useful even if there's a few of you around the table thinking about where there's struggle for implementation or where people are supporting efforts and where they're not supporting efforts, and just being able to write it down depersonalizes it a little bit and makes it more possible that you can move these efforts forward successfully. The next question that we have is, Dwayne, this is actually for you. The question is, how did the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation think about power mapping as you were doing your diversity, equity, and inclusion work? And Dwayne, I think it would also be helpful if you could describe your role within the foundation and how you have the senior advisor to the president role that you have, and how that is about the diversity, equity, and inclusion work.
Certainly. So as senior advisor to the president and working on these issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, I've been given a few resources to make the job somewhat easier, and also to make the job relevant to all aspects of the foundation. One of those assets that I have available to me is our Diversity and Inclusion Committee. The Diversity and Inclusion Committee, soon to be renamed the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, used the Foundation Roles Framework to help design a new paradigm for how RWJF should look at itself. The previous paradigm had us, the previous paradigm is well known and is probably similar to many of our institutions, was that you think of your foundation as a grant maker and as an employer, and focuses on those two areas. By using the Foundation Roles Framework, we're able to also look at the foundation in two additional areas. One is being a community citizen, and the other is being an economic driver, an economic entity. Using those four areas, our committee, which is represented by staff from each area within the foundation, the staff were able to assess things that the foundation had been doing in the efforts for equity, diversity, and inclusion, and also what things we could do in the areas that were well known to us by being a funder and an employer, but also as being a community citizen and an economic entity. And that's been very, very helpful to us in our work. We use power mapping by power mapping the foundation as a whole. To look at the units and by perspectives and who was leading and how the leaders of those units were embracing not only the recommendations, but also how they were participating and showing up in senior staff meetings and others as we discussed matters of equity, diversity, and inclusion. We prioritize for the foundation focusing on our work as an economic entity, so focusing on procurement in these early years, and also focusing on the areas of recruitment and retention, as we saw those as priority areas. And in coming years, we'll get to the other two domain areas. one clue that we've discovered in thinking about procurement for the parts of the foundation that are slower to embrace this work or slower to understand the value and the need for this work is to, as they look at who their vendors are, their contractors, advisors, and other experts that may be hired to help us do our work. We wanted to make certain that whoever works with us shares our values for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And in doing so, units within the foundation did hit a couple of walls. And so the recommendation back to them was to look at the vendors who you spend the most money with, and then prioritize those as the ones that you really want to make certain that their values match our own. And if not, then we have to think about what could be done about that situation. So I want to throw that out as a helpful tip for those working in procurement areas. But our mapping worked out very well, and for the most part, we've kept the maps fairly private, because someone who may be a opponent in one domain, in one area, for one aspect of work, probably doesn't want to be known as an opponent. And also those opponents may evolve and change. And so, posting these things up on a wall publicly would not help us bring folks along who we really do need their support for.
Dwayne, that's a great point. And these, the power mapping is intended to be a tool for your small group that's working through strategy. It's not meant for you to like share on your intranet of, here are the staff members that are against these efforts. Both for that reason that, it's going to be even harder to get somebody on your side if they feel like they've been labeled as an enemy to your work. Mm-hmm. And secondarily, to that point of somebody may be an opponent just because they're not happy that you're not pushing hard enough. And so it can be really sort of misleading as you have folks that are listed there. So really keep those tools internal. The next question we've got is from Jen, and she says, any feedback or things to be aware of when you're going external with racial equity work, specifically when you're having a convening. They're hosting a community-wide event for the National Day of Racial Healing and would appreciate any guidance or potential blind spots. So Jen, my advice on this, and Dwayne and Karyn, feel free to jump in, is that, it's a delicate spot to
I'll answer from my purview. I think being able to define, I'm sorry?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that when going external and in any conversations around racial equity, being really clear about what your terms mean, so that people do not have the opportunity to think that if you're talking, be clear, if you're talking about racism or structural racism, define your terms as you go along. Just recently, we had a very important meeting where we introduced the term racial equity to the group that was there, and defined it as racial equity is when one's race does not statistically decide how one fares in life. And that definition sunk in, and folks were able to come along. And it also made it easier for them to think about, okay, what is structural racism? Many times, using the redlining maps are very, very helpful. And Trista, where you're located, I think I have a redlining map from St. Paul, Minnesota. Not only shows how St. Paul had been redlined in the 1930s, but in that map itself, it says this is a Jewish ghetto. This is a Italian or Negro slum. This is an Italian new immigrant area. And so folks could see that the social policy of the day also influenced the political understanding of communities and communities that were worthy of being disinvested in or not invested in. And just having that example to say, this is what we're talking about. We're not talking necessarily about hate crimes, hate groups, or anything like that. We're talking about when racism shows up in public policy. So I hope that helps.
Super helpful. And Jen, the other piece that I would add is that, going back to that perfect not being the enemy of the good. So many organizations hesitate on doing external work or asking their grantees about how diverse their boards are if they haven't finished their internal work. And I think that can be a really huge issue and stop progress. So it isn't about everything being perfect internally before you go external, but it is about being vulnerable and honest about challenges and how your organization is thinking about addressing those challenges, because you will get those questions when you're hosting public groups and public events, and they'll say, well, what are you doing about this? And just being willing to say, like, we're testing this out and we're doing our own learning and we're trying to figure out what's next. We for sure don't have it all figured out, but we're willing to create the space for these sort of conversations is a really critical role for foundations. So this webinar will be available for playback if you have folks within your team or in other organizations that you want to share it with. It'll be available tomorrow at tristaharris.com. Thank you so much for joining us today and for your fantastic questions. Karyn and Dwayne, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. It was wonderful to hear how you're thinking about this really important issue within your organizations. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you.